You'll notice he no longer suffers delusions of humanity.
Affirmative.
Well, tribe, welcome back. We're here to get to the part we all been waiting for. We're going to talk about Miss Annie Besant, and we're going to see what that old lady's up to. Now, as in the previous episodes, we really ain't going to waste no time today, so we're going to go ahead and get into Chapter 5.
This better be good.
Chapter 5, Mrs. Besant's Conversion. Now that the mantle of Madame Blavatsky has fallen upon Mrs. Besant, we are justified in inquiring into her history, to ascertain whether her preaching should be accepted or rejected. But I should mention that Mrs. Besant's mantle does not resemble Madame Blavatsky's in the least. Instead of a greasy old blouse, the front covered with cigarette ash, Mrs. Besant wears, when upon the platform, an elegant costume. It consists of a robe of soft white silk, richly draped with very heavy gold fringe. The front is embroidered with Theosophic designs in gold. With a pair of property wings added, it would make an ideal dress for a stage archangel. Mrs. Besant, with her beautiful white hair and lovely robe, makes a very imposing picture at a distance. But joking apart, I will endeavor to be quite fair to the good lady. I fear I am inclined to be a little sarcastic, as I do not believe a bit in her preaching. The life of Mrs. Besant has been an interesting study to me from time she resided in my native town, Chittenden. Before the birth of her child, she was apparently a most devout Christian. Her husband was a clergyman, a brother of Sir Walter Besant. He was an estimable gentleman, much respected. He held an important appointment as master of the Chittenden College. The first surprise Mrs. Besant gave us was her sudden abandonment of motherhood. She left her home, husband, and infant and joined a Free Thought Society in London. She then became a rabid atheist and poured scorn and ridicule upon Christ and Christianity with all the vehemence and eloquence at her command. She also joined the socialist movement and became a perfect firebrand in that direction. Undoubtedly, the most regrettable incident of her life was the part she took in the publication of The Fruits of Philosophy, one of the most obscene pamphlets ever printed. Doubtless, Mrs. Besant thought she was conferring a great boon on poor women with large families, but the least consideration given would have convinced her of the pernicious effect the book would have, being placed within the reach of every boy and girl at 6 pence a copy. Before she joined Madame Blavatsky, it became evident that Mrs. Besant was becoming dissatisfied with life into which she had drifted. Her lectures upon atheism and socialism became fewer and less vehement. I saw a change coming over her, but I was not prepared for an extraordinary gymnastic display. She suddenly turned a complete somersault and with one bound jumped from atheism to the boulder dash, claptrap, and hanky-panky of Blavatskyism. And what was the cause of this mysterious acrobatic feat? Simply the reading of a book, The Secret Doctrine, by Madame Blavatsky. Mrs. Besant merely read it. She did not stop to inquire whether the work was original or a hash of Eastern dogmas, which it has since been proven to be. Sanskrit scholars have proved that it is full of plagiarisms. In some places they have found whole pages copied bodily, with a little alteration in the text. Mrs. Besant considers that of no consequence. She says what is new in the book is not what has been found by Orientalists, and may be pointed to as one or another sacred book of the world. What is new is the knowledge which enabled her to select from the whole of these facts which build up on a single mighty conception of the evolution of the universe. She goes on to say that Madame Blavatsky had no education to enable her to accomplish this feat. Here, Mrs. Besant does not speak correctly. Madame Blavatsky was an exceedingly clever woman and possessed great literary ability. For many years, she contributed articles to the Russian press, and she picked up fair knowledge of Sanskrit, quite enough to enable her to plagiarize Eastern dogmas. Mrs. Besant further argues that no Orientalist has ever accomplished such a task. I opine that it would not have been worthwhile for any Orientalist to attempt it, unless he had wished to fabricate a new religion out of scraps of old ones. No, Mrs. Besant, your arguments are very clever, but they would not hold water. Madame Blavatsky was no inspired saint. I fear you do not know as much about her as I do. She was almost as clever with her pencil as with her pen, and she pretended that her sketches were inspired. Do you know that? When she was lodging at an hotel, she made a great sensation by leaving drawing materials upon a table when she retired for the night, and finding exquisite sketches of spirit forms in a diaphus, drapery upon the papers in the morning. She was suspected and watched by 4 gentlemen who saw her get up in the night and execute the sketches. I will give the account of Mrs. Besant's conversion to Theosophy as she herself tells it. After reading The Secret Doctrine, she sought an interview with the author and was completely captivated by her. Mrs. Besant proposed to join the society. The crafty old Madame Blavatsky, seeing the impression she had produced, resorted to a clever move to inspire confidence. She fixed her eyes on Mrs. Besant and said, "Have you read the report about me in the Society for Psychical Research?" "No," said Mrs. Besant. "I had never heard of it." Madame replied, "Then go and read it, and after reading it, you come back. Well." Mrs. Besant took a copy home and read it. She says, "I laughed aloud at the absurdity and flung the report aside with righteous scorn of an honest nature that knew its own kin when it met them, and shrank from the foulness of the lie." Mrs. Besant went back to Madame Blavatsky and literally flung herself into her arms. After the embrace, Madame, looking into Mrs. Besant's eyes, said solemnly, "You are a noble woman. May Master bless you." Such was the conversion of Mrs. Besant. Was ever blind faith more clearly exemplified? But was there not something behind that blind faith? We shall see. The conversion of Mrs. Besant was so strange and sudden that many believe Madame had hypnotized her. That is the most charitable explanation, and not an impossible one, for without a doubt, Madame Blavatsky possessed hypnotic power to a large degree. I remember an incident which she clearly proves it. She was conversing with a nervous gentleman who she wanted to join the society, and being in a playful mood, she rolled up her handkerchief and threw it upon the floor, saying that it was a venomous snake. The gentleman ran away from her in great terror, and it was some time before he could be convinced that he had not seen a snake. We also hear that when Madame was in Paris in 1858, she experimented with hypnotism, and Dayanand Saraswati said that she practiced hypnotism. She herself boasted that she had so much control over Colonel Olcott and that he did not know his head from his heels. Hypnotism may account for extraordinary influence and fascination which Madame Blavatsky was able to exercise over some people, and yet she was one of the most repulsive women one can imagine. A glance at the excellent sketch of her in this pamphlet would show that she had an appearance of being a gross, vulgar, sensual adventuress. She turned the scale at 17 stone. The enormous ring upon her hand, she said, possessed magical power. She had an enormous appetite, consuming vast quantities of fat meat, although her doctrine teaches that it is a deadly sin to eat meat. She had an insatiable love for tobacco and was seldom seen without a cigarette in her mouth. Her language at times was too bad for publication. This description may be considered an exaggeration, and so to confirm it, I will quote a description of Madame Blavatsky by Mabel Collins, who was for a time her intimate associate and co-editor of the Theosophical print, Lucifer. Miss Collins says, "She taught me one great lesson. I learned from her how foolish, how gullible, how easily flattered human beings are, taken in mass. Her contempt for her kind was on the same gigantic scale as everything else about her, except for her marvelously delicate taper fingers. In all else, she was a big woman. She had a great power over the weak and credulous, a greater capacity for making black appear white, a larger waist, a more voracious appetite, a more confirmed passion for tobacco, a more ceaseless and insatiable hatred of those whom she thought to be her enemies, a greater disrespect for less conveniences, a worse temper, a greater command of bad language, a greater intent for the intelligence of her fellow beings than I have ever supposed possible to be contained in one person. These, I suppose, must be reckoned as her vices, though whether a creature so indifferent to all ordinary standards of right and wrong can be held to have virtues or vices, I know not. It is almost impossible to account for Mrs. Besant's sudden infatuation for such a creature. Her friends were up in arms about it. She was a great loss to the Free Thought Society. Everything possible was done to get her to reconsider the matter. The seriousness of allying herself with a woman who had been proved to be a gross impostor by evidence absolutely irrefutable was pointed out, but Mrs. Besant turned a deaf ear to all evidence and advice. The fact was, she wanted to change, and here was the very thing to suit her. Mrs. Besant had the reputation of being an honest, misguided woman always striving to benefit her fellow creatures. But unfortunately, she usually did them great harm. I shared that opinion of her at the time, but her actions since then have revealed the fact that what has led her into these strange paths can be summed up into one word: vanity. She has an irresistible desire to be in the limelight, to be in a position to display her marvelous gift of speech. So we see after the death of Madame Blavatsky, the society is in need of a new figurehead. Look no further than Annie Besant. So they wanted to get away from the dank, old, gypsiest babushka appearance and aura of Blavatsky and try to get more towards an angelic figurehead. As we find out in the chapter, she was going for the Mahatma deification, or the Mahatma aspect. We were talking about how she was wearing pure white robes and linens with gold trimmings and fringes. Trying to put her in the best light to get away, or appear to get away from the dark, gritty deception that they had been known for previously. You could also see that she wasn't really marching to the beat of her own drum. She was like a leaf in the breeze. She went from one extreme to the other. She started out a Christian, a family woman. Next thing you know, she's abandoning her family. She became a communist, or excuse me, a socialist. It's like what Red Wolf was speaking on one time, the worship gene. She went from extreme devotion to extreme rebellion to the extreme need to be deified or worshipped. I'm going to be looking into some of her writings so we can get any further insight into that. But the way that she came into the society is what gets me. She went and saw Blavatsky speak. Blavatsky told her to read something. She saw that it was a load of garbage. She shows back up to Blavatsky and does what I expected personally. Acted phony. So I think it's because she saw an opportunity, So we can see that about Miss Besant. She's an opportunist. So we're going to see what this opportunist took the opportunity to do. So we're going to move on to chapter 6. Chapter 6. Theosophy in London. At a small meeting in a house in Avenue Road, Madame Blavatsky's headquarters, when she was trying to start a society in London, a friend of mine put a few pertinent questions to her. "Tell me, madam," said he, "how do the Mahatmas exist in these inaccessible places, and how do they employ their time there?" She replied, "They require but little sustenance. A few herbs sometimes are all that is necessary. Their time is spent mostly in studying the secret forces of nature, electricity, astronomy, chemistry, and in prayer." But said my friend, "Can you show me that they have added in any way to our knowledge of electricity, astronomy, chemistry, or any other science?" She replied, "The result of their studies will be made manifest in due time. The world is not yet prepared for such knowledge." My friend persisted and said, "But why do they shut themselves up in mountain fastness? You tell us that all Eastern philosophers were Mahatmas, but they came amongst their disciples and preached their own doctrines. They did not employ a lady to preach for them. Even our old friend Diogenes came out of his tub sometimes and said some wise things." Madam replied, "There is too much sin in towns and cities. These holy men cannot endure to be near it. The sacred city of Lhasa is the only city in the world where these holy men can visit and preach to their disciples." Then she described the beauties of the sacred city. Vice was unknown there. It was a paradise of purity and holiness. The wily old lady thought this a safe venture and that her statement would never be refuted, because no European had for many years been allowed to approach the sacred city. She reckoned without Tommy Atkins. A few years ago, Tommy was ordered to Lhasa, and he got there in spite of all opposition. And what did he find? One of the filthiest places on the face of the earth. The poor, degraded inhabitants were loathsome in the extreme, and as Tommy went through the muddy streets, he was obliged to hold his nose. The stench was so great. Colonel Younghusband thought it prudent to camp a mile or more outside the city for fear of infection. I was curious to see what Mrs. Besant would say when these dispatches arrived. Would she shut her eyes again and in righteous indignation cry, "Forgeries"? Or would she openly say, "We have been deceived by Madame Blavatsky. Tibet is not as it was represented. There are no Mahatmas there"? She didn't either, but was mum. No allusion of any kind was made to this damning evidence. Madame Blavatsky fixed the abode of the Mahatmas in the Kashmir Pass. Mrs. Besant says they reside near Shigatse. Let us see what Mr. Rockhill, the famous explorer of Tibet, has to say on the matter. Mr. Rockhill has given us more information about the country and its inhabitants than any other traveler. He has had the great advantage of knowing the language thoroughly. He was for many years Secretary of the United States Legation at Peking, during which time he made the acquaintance of an old Lama with whom he studied the language for 4 years. He was also a good Chinese linguist, and with the necessary escort, he was received by the Lamas favorably. He was entertained at some of the largest lamaseries and thus obtained much information. He spent some time in the neighborhood of the Shigatse and made friends with a Chinese tea traveler who knew the country like a book. Mr. Rockhill made special inquiries as to whether there were any such persons as Mahatmas in the country and was laughed at greatly. The idea was so absurd. But what is all this evidence to Mrs. Besant? Madame Blavatsky's word against the world? Colonel Olcott displayed more candor. He knew that Madame Blavatsky lied, and he admitted it. He said, I have heard her tell the most convicting stories about herself, but he tried to excuse her by suggesting that she might be a dual personality. She had certainly bulk enough for two. The Colonel's idea was that she was a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. At one time she was a fibbing Russian woman, at another an inspired Mahatma. Mrs. Besant has recently told us that Jesus is now reincarnated and lives in the mountains of Lebanon. It is quite possible there is a piglet there, or what is most likely, a poor demented creature who believes himself to be Jesus. Such persons are common objects of our lunatic asylum. But Mrs. Besant has capped the story with one that I think she must have been told to test how far the credulity of her disciples will go. Those who believe it are unfit to have control of their finances. I would give it in Mrs. Besant's own words. Long, long ago, he who is now Master K.H. Koot Humi was taken prisoner in a battle with an Egyptian army and was generously befriended and sheltered by an Egyptian of high rank. Thousands of years later, help is needed for the nascent Theosophical Society, and the Master, looking over India for one to aid in the great work, sees his old friend of the Egyptian and other lives, now Mr. A.P. Sinnett, editing the leading Anglo-Indian newspaper, The Pioneer. Mr. Sinnett goes as usual to Simla. Madame Blavatsky goes up thither to form the link. Mr. Sinnett is drawn within the immediate influence of the Master, receives instructions from him, becomes the author of the occult world and the esoteric Buddhism, carrying to thousands the message of Theosophy. This is the stuff given for the delectation of thousands who fill the large Queen's Hall to overflowing. Poor old imposter Madame Blavatsky never achieved such success with all her lying and cunning, for she died a comparatively poor woman on May 8, 1891. Thus ended the career of the greatest imposter in history. Had she turned her great talent to better use, she would have found that honesty is the best policy. So they started off the chapter returning to the lying antics of Mahatma Blavatsky. We see that she was doing the same old thing, running her old game. She was called out on her lies by the author's friend, and then a man by the name of Rockhill took it further and confronted the new leader of the society. And after Blavatsky died, people within the society turned on her, like her old thrall, Colonel Olcott. It would make sense to me that upon her passing, he was awakened from whatever spell she had him under, because I won't lie, I believe that is possible. I've seen it, but that's for another video that's going to be coming after we finish this book. But you see, Olcott tried to save her reputation by saying, oh, she's just a crazy old lady. Nice try, but no. But I guess society's reputation comes above all, and they were doing, and probably still are doing, whatever it takes to maintain a good reputation for the society. And just so the Theosophical Society knows, because I've been looking at my views to like ratio. I know y'all are in here looking, and I'm here to let you know I'm coming for you. Y'all got the right one. I'm on you. Now I also want to speak on Besant's origin story for the Mahatma Koot Humi. My first red flag that she's on some stuff is she started off with long ago. She didn't have exact dates. She didn't have none of that. Fraud, right? That's what it's screaming to me. This is a red flag on the play already. Red card, red flag, whatever. For all you sports people out there. Now, if you're a subscriber of Red Wolf's channel and people like Con Drop, Curdy Mayo, etc., we know that Egypt was a time period, but then it was perverted and fell victim to revisionist history. So when she's saying Egypt, I know most of you are thinking of the Egypt over there in Eurasia. But that's all phony. So to me, that's a red flag. And if you want to argue that with me, I'm not going to argue with you people.
Huh? What do you mean, you people?
What do you mean, you people?
I am going to challenge you to carry your tail over to Red Wolf's channel, listen to what he has to say, and go research the information that he shares. Then you can come back over here and talk to me. Because I don't argue with people. So we're going to be doing a whole lot more research going forward about the Mahatmas, because like my brother 0 Point Energy, or DJ ZPE, mentioned in a comment on a previous video, he was like, Mahatma Gandhi. And it struck me, I was like, he's right. And I ain't gonna lie, I don't really know anything about him other than his name and that he was important over there in Hindustan. They taught about it in school, but I wasn't really caring and I wasn't paying attention. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna find out what he did, what was so important about him. And he's got to have a connection to the Theosophical Society, because they're the only people who are running around here talking about Mahatmas. So I don't claim to be a know-it-all, I just connect dots. So we're going to do some more research on that. We also see that Blavatsky never lived to see the success or perceived success that Besant was able to see. So that leads me to believe, or it leads me to question, was Mahatma Blavatsky a pawn the whole time? And if so, who was she the pawn of? We're going to find that answer eventually. It won't be this time. It'll be on a future episode. I'm going to have to go do some more digging. And when I find it, y'all know I'll be back here with y'all. I want to thank you once again, tribe, as always, for coming in here, spending some time with me during visiting hours. You're doing some good reading, I think. So we're going to be on to chapter 7 in the next video. Make sure you like, share, subscribe. I'm going to catch you guys on the next one.
Why don't you bring your media cameras over there if you want to see some real truth?
So say good night to the bad guy. Go on.
I am a human being. I exist.
Delusions, Mr. Wordsworth. Delusions.
Send the word.